start this session, Vulindlela is going to do kind of a brief recap. One of the things that drove us as we were trying to start in the 60s was the ongoing national civil rights movement. That was a huge motivating factor for us, and our connections with people who were greatly and deeply involved in that is one of the things that motivated and kept us going. So as a kind of a lead-in to the 60s panel, Vulindlela is going to do a brief kind of description of where we were as a people.
Thank you, Bob. This is going to be the fastest history of a movement ever, which I call the Golden Age. In 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her bus seat marked the beginning of the civil rights movement, renamed the Human Rights Movement by Malcolm X. A bus boycott by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under the leadership of MLK began the history of civil disobedience in the South. In 1957, the Jamaica Rifle Club, organized by ex-Marine Robert Williams, repulsed an armed Klan caravan. During the skirmish, Williams placed a white bystander in a house to protect him from the crossfire and was charged with kidnapping. Williams and his wife fled to Cuba and China and produced a radical newspaper calling for an African-American revolution. Thus was born two camps: those who believed in civil disobedience to achieve liberation, like the NAACP, CORE, etc., and those who felt blacks should take up arms to do so, like the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, Revolutionary Action Movement, Black Panther Party, RNA, etc. In 1954, IBM's first computer initiated an information revolution. But in 1956, the USSR, or Russia, placed Sputnik in orbit. The US government then called black engineer and inventor Joe Blair, whose two-stage moon rocket design they had rejected in 1926, to head the space program NASA. They used Blair's design to place a man on the moon in 1969. So the space age began with the invention of a black genius. In 1960, SNCC, led by Stokely Carmichael, initiated sit-ins in the South. They were protected by the Deacons for Defense and Justice, a secretive organization composed of black war veterans. The Deacons defeated several armed Klan attacks, which drove the Shan from confrontation to politics. In 1968, at San Francisco State University, a massive black student strike resulted in the formation of the first Black Studies Department and College of Ethnic Studies in U.S. history. This paved the way for Black Studies departments in northern colleges. Martin Luther King's nonviolent protest did not work in the North, and militant blacks were inspired by the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Alabama, who conducted armed patrols to defend organizers of a black voter register campaign. Stokely Carmichael was their chair. Their Black Panther Party logo earned them the nickname the Black Panther Party, the first one of three. In 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X publicly stated that the chickens have come home to roost, which led to his exit from the Nation of Islam, his Hajj to Mecca, his adoption of an African name, Omowali, and his efforts to convince African nations to charge the United States before the United States nations with genocide. RAM Chairman Muhammad Ahmed secured permission from Lowndes County Freedom Organization Chairman Stokely Carmichael to use the Black Panther in the name of their political parties. In 1965, the San Francisco Bay Area RAM cadre registered their organization as the Black Panther Party of Northern California, the second of three, under the leadership of Mamadou Lumumba. Shortly thereafter, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the third Black Panther Party, was formed by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in Oakland and became the most widely publicized radical black organization in the nation. Meanwhile, Stokely Carmichael advocated black power, changed his name to Kwame Ture, and founded the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. In Los Angeles, Maulana Karanga founded US organization, stressed the need for cultural revolution, and invented Kwanzaa. During this time, black identity was symbolized in James Brown's hit song, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. in African hairstyles and dress, and in the black arts movement. But in February 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated in New York. An ominous spirit hung over the nation. Langston Hughes' most famous poem referred to black disillusionment as a dream deferred, and it went like this. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags on like a heavy load, or does it explode? In August 1965, the dream deferred exploded in Watts, California. Reports of police brutality sent black rebels into armed combat with the police for 6 days with mutual casualties. Property damage was in the millions. In the subsequent Detroit Rebellion, black militants repulsed the police and the National Guard and were only subdued by Marines supported by tanks and combat helicopters. In the following years, over 200 black rebellions shook the nation to its foundation. The government responded with formation of programs to mitigate racial tension and complement civil rights legislation, like OAO, Head Start, health centers, job training, but more tragedy lay ahead. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, as was presidential candidate Bobby Kennedy. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King expressed a desire for greater cooperation among blacks and even took a picture together. Many felt this is why they were assassinated. A united Malcolm X and MLK could not be allowed to happen. In 1968, 500 black militants formed the Republic of New Africa, who advocated formation of an independent black nation in 5 majority states, black majority states in the South. A teenage Tupac Shakur was in training as a new African Panther. Yes, he was. 2 years later, the Black Liberation Army launched a military offensive against the New York police. During one encounter, Assata Shakur, the auntie of Tupac Shakur, was captured, later liberated from jail by BLA soldiers, and escaped to asylum in Cuba. Amazingly, the Black Revolution in the United States had generated all the elements of an anti-colonial struggle for independence in a country where they were a despised and oppressed minority who should not have been so bold as to shoot back and advocate a black nation on American soil. In 1970-80, featured institutional development in businesses and schools, such as Malcolm X University and Nairobi College and East Palo Alto. These were known nationwide. Major historical works were published by black scholars, Chancellor William Shekant Diop and others, which affirmed that Nubia and Egypt were black African civilizations, the greatest in history. Black America sent delegations to the 6th Pan-African Congress and the Second Festival of African Culture, and to work and study in Africa. Hip-hop and rap became the culture of young black America. Black movies, like The Spook Who Sat by the Door, proliferated, and black participation increased in movies, public office, and television. In 1989, a Nigerian, Philip Emeagwali, invented the first supercomputer by linking 35,000 computers, which established him as the father of the internet, consensus. But most government programs designed to address racism were dismantled. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cloning and sperm, egg, and embryo banks emerged as controversial alternative methods for reproduction. Barack Obama won 2 U.S. presidencies in a row, but the right wing rode the waves of racist reaction to Obama's presidency to empowerment, where we live now. Since 1990, newly arriving groups with their cultural identity intact formed ethnic communities with thriving economies. It could be said that these ethnicities struggle to keep their group identity. African Americans struggle to retain theirs. The question now is, as Martin Luther King's book title stated, where do we go from here? Thank you.
All right, as you can hear from that, a lot of what went on in East Palo Alto, especially during the 60s and 70s, were directly related to the things that were happening at the national level. As a matter of fact, Stokely Carmichael essentially became an advisor for the group that was here. It started in around 1962, called the Floating Crap Game. And so this panel, a lot of our discussion this morning is going to be about that, but I want to just say one other last thing before we get into the discussion. The format for this entire weekend kind of is there will be panel discussions that will speak to four major categories, four major situations that were present in this community. The political situation, economics, education, and I'm missing the fourth one, and the social and cultural. And the panel members will talk about those in broad terms, but they'll also talk about their experience in this community during that time period. This happens to be the 1960s decade. And then the small group sessions that will follow after each panel discussion. So for today, the small group sessions will be the people who were active in the 1960s in this community. So some of you it may be decades later or whatever, but for the people who were active in the 60s, now when we're so all that will be done in this room because we don't have breakout rooms, but when we get to East Side this afternoon, there will be breakout rooms, and so that the groups will be no more than 10 people, probably somewhere around 5 or 6 people. So everybody will have about 15, maybe 20 minutes to talk about their own history and their involvement in that particular time period.
I'd say among these topics that Bob has mentioned, I probably was more active in the economic and employment and education segment. I became active in East Palo Alto in the mid-60s, even though I was living in Mountain View at the time, and it was primarily through the Mid-Peninsula Congress of Racial Equality, who were focusing at that time on employment issues, primarily in Palo Alto and in getting jobs for people of color. But I'd say that most of my activities were in the educational sector, not only in the public side, but also in the private side. On the okay. In the educational sector,
There you go.
of course, like most of the folk here, I became active in the Saturday day school, which eventually led to the establishment of the day school and then the college. On the public side, somewhere in the late 60s, I think 1968, people within the educational movement, Mary Hoover and Mrs. Wilkes and Barbara Mouton and others, asked me if I would be willing to accept a vacancy appointment to the Sequoia Union High School District, which I gladly accepted. And it was quite a learning experience for me. And I was able to last about a year, and it was just a little bit too overwhelming. As I would like to phrase it, the only thing that we agreed on was the roll call. And, but I tried as long as I could, but I was honored to be chosen to accept this position, which I greatly appreciate. And I think I was the first African American to be on the Sequoia board. Fortunately, I was succeeded by another African American male, but I'll just end at that.
I just wanted to say a little bit about the formation of this group, the Floating Crap Game. In, I believe it was 1961 or 62, the city of Palo Alto and the county of San Mateo got together, and the Palo Alto golf course, when I first came here, was a part of East Palo Alto. And so the city of Palo Alto and the county of San Mateo got together and they made a trade the city of Palo Alto got that land, which is now the golf course, and there's some other businesses on the other side of Embarcadero that were also a part of East Palo Alto. They traded that, and that kind of somehow sparked Ed Beck's to get going. And Ed started recruiting people, and when he came to talk to me about it, he said, you know, we've got to do something or the surrounding cities are just going to, you know, eat up all of our land, and we won't have a tax base or anything else to deal with. So, and in the process of that recruitment, we wound up with roughly about 30 people, maybe been a few more than that was in that group. And the group would meet at least once a month, and it moved around from house to house. So whoever's house the meeting was at for that particular evening, that person was the chairperson. So it was a group that had no permanent chairperson, and but the thing that was amazing to me as I look back on it was how long that group stayed together. Because it was the group that had the first study of incorporation done in 1963. That study was done by the students in the Stanford Law School, and Felton Henderson was the professor of that class. And that study for incorporation kind of became almost like the Bible that we kind of looked at and moved on, moving towards incorporation. And the last thing I'll say, it took us 20 years to eventually get to incorporation. So when I talk to young people, I always emphasize that time frame so that they can understand that most of the things that are important don't come easy. And you got to have the ability to stick it out. And so that's kind of how all of this got started. And that group stayed together through roughly about 1972, and then it kind of began to disintegrate. And later on we'll talk about the names of the people.
The point I want to make here is when Bob says it took a long time and it was hard work. Folks, we had to go to the voters twice. We organized, we had a referendum for incorporation. The county board of supervisors threw out the winning results and said it didn't happen. We reorganized, went back to the community, had another election, referendum. We won again. And that's when they said, okay, we give only for that much.
Oh, I did. This is Syrtilla Kabat. Syrtilla. And one of the few remaining members of the floating craft gang is Bob, her, a couple others.
Yeah, the ones that are I think here today is Helen Harvey, Mel Harris, Syrtilla, Hank, and myself. I think those are the only people who are here today that were members of that group. And most of them, unfortunately, have left the planet. So last thing I want to say is, and then we're going to have other people talk. Vulindlela talked about the National Civil Rights Movement. Well, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC kind of became the guiding force for us. We kind of adopted their philosophy about community control. It was called Black Power at that time. And Stokely came here on many occasions to speak, to meet with us in small group sessions, give advice. And there are a couple of things that I'll talk about later, that Stokely, he was just an amazing person. And so we'll have some conversations or comments from other people about what they remember about Stokely. So I'm gonna let other people talk now. Martha was one of the first teachers at the day school, and we'll let them go.
Sure. Okay, I'm Martha, and I'm going to give you all of my names because There's a reason for that. Martha Goodwill Murray Hanks. I moved to East Palo Alto at the age of 10 in 1957. So it'll be 62 years next month that I've been here in East Palo Alto. I moved from Louisiana, came to East Palo Alto, which was in terms of education, which is interesting. Louisiana was still segregated at that time, moved here in integration. But I think what many people may not know is that even though in Louisiana we were segregated in terms of schools and churches and other things, in terms of playing with other kids who were white, Caucasian, we still played in terms of neighbors. So that was something that I think not many people may know. I attended Kavanaugh School, which is now Cesar Chavez, Green Oaks, which is now Ravenswood Middle School, Ravenswood High School. I attended Ravenswood High School in 1960. Ravenswood started in 1958, with 21% black enrollment. And I went there in 61 with 37%, just in terms of numbers. I graduated in 1965, and it was 60% African American. These numbers are African American. Okay. And then, of course, later on, in 1969, it was 87% black because of people moving out of the area. And then in 1970, they started this new voluntary inter-school busing program for the so-called new Ravenswood. And so we had kids who were bused out, moved into the rest of the Sequoia Union High School district. And it became, by the time Ravenswood closed, it was 65% black enrollment, because we had all these other students who were from other districts who came to East Palo Alto. And I remember going there. My cousin was in trouble or something, and I went to the school to find out what was going on. And at that time, Ravenswood was such a revolutionary school that there were no bells. The classes were meeting. The schedules were more complicated than what I was going to in college, because every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, there were certain classes, and Tuesday, Thursdays, and then they switched and so forth. So there was surfing, there was skiing, there was all of these activities that were going on there that encouraged all of these white kids to come to Ravenswood that was not going on anywhere else in the Sequoia Union High School district. So when they closed in '76, I think it was probably because of the fact that parents were starting to figure out that, well, maybe I shouldn't be sending my kids to go an hour, half an hour to another school when they could be getting their education right at Ravenswood. Okay, so as an aside from that, in 1967, because of some things that were going on, there was an East Palo Alto, the Mothers for Equal Education, and I think it was Bob's, I think this was his idea from my memory, anyway. The East Palo Alto Teen Summer Project, and I think that was probably the most ideal situation that has ever happened in East Palo Alto, which I would love to see happen again, is that we had Mary Hoover and other educators teaching us who were college students. We were doing reading, math, whatever, a lot of things. And then the college students were teaching the teenagers who, in the afternoon, we were paid, the teenagers were paid, and the teenagers were teaching preschoolers and kindergartners in the afternoons in their homes. And it was just something that's just, I think was just totally just, anyway.
Each one teach one.
Each one teach one. We go
Right.
back in their backyards, wherever we were meeting. Yes, the kids were taught in their homes, in their backyards. So Where am I going? Okay. I get excited. Anyways, I'm going to relax. And then, of course, at that same time, there were things going on in the community in terms of the sneak out program, the Nairobi School, which started in 1966 and on Saturdays, Nairobi Day School. In 1969, Nairobi High School was made a 5-day, and then also at the same time, 1969, Nairobi Day School was 5 days a week. Yes. Nairobi Cultural Center, 1969. Over 1,000 people. Okay, so we're talking about that.
Done?
Okay,
Go ahead.
I didn't find out, I have to admit this, you guys. I didn't find out until I taught at Nairobi Day School, and my classroom was bombed. I was interviewed by, anyway, and they did an article in the paper, and it stated that Miss Murray is, and they described me as being loquacious. I had to look it up at that time. I didn't realize I talk a lot. So, that's about it.
Yeah, Miss Murray, she was the wife at the time of George Murray, head of Ministry of Education for the Black Panther Party.
Oh, and I did go to San Francisco State University.
Yeah.
I was there during the times of the
strike.
strike. And my father was a bail bondsman, and he got Eldridge out when he flew the country. Eldridge Cleaver.
Okay. Thank you, Martha. Very good. And next we have, would you like to go first? All right, go ahead.
My husband and I moved here from Stanford. We were Stanford students. He had just finished medical school and was beginning his internship. And I was a speech and hearing therapist, and soon after, at some point, became a faculty person at San Jose State. Martha was telling you about our Teen Summer Project. It was one of the most powerful community-based projects that we had here in East Palo Alto. Not only did our high school students teach the younger students, the preschoolers, the first graders, our high school students were taught economics by our college students. An example of the economics was our teens went throughout the community, including Palo Alto, surveying the pharmaceutical stores, Walgreens, Disco Rex, Baneth. And what they did is they compared drugs. And that information was given to our parents in the evening. So our teens went to class in the morning, being taught by our college students. In the afternoon, they taught the youngsters. And in the evening, they went, in a way, to those parents as well as door to door, teaching economics. So we had a growing base of young people here in East Palo Alto who were very well educated. And do you understand what I mean by education? They were tuned into economics, they were tuned into reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as the social, political activities, needs of the community. Later, oh, and by the way, Martha was one of our teachers who taught African dance. Now, you may think, oh, That was a nice recreational class. Well, folks, I'm a PhD social clinical psychologist. I live now in Kansas City, and about 10 years ago, into my practice came a young woman who later, after we dealt with personal problems, later reintroduced herself to me. She was one of the students that Martha had taught. And the African dance that she learned, that's how she earned her way through college. She did classes, and some of you know her. Her first name is Elise. I do not remember her teenage name, but the reason you would know her, she was the young girl who Mrs. Wilkes snuck out of Richmond and enrolled in our local community as one of us. So the reaches of the positivity of our day school, our team project, it reaches far. And now, at least, she's retired from being a principal in one of the local high school districts. And she and her family, they have relocated to Panama, and they own a boutique hotel in Panama City. So, now, out of that teen summer project, as well as the political activities around it, it became clear that we needed to do something about our education system. Remember, the area is unincorporated. Now, what do we need to do? First of all, we needed to become our own school board. Our school board members were appointed by the county. And so our youngsters were introduced, and Bob, being a great community organizer, they were taught, they were already going door to door. We just expanded their information, and it resulted in Bob and I being elected to the school board. And down the road, the county appointment became more pro the community because of the influence that Bob and I had. Originally, we would not accept a leadership role, i.e., president of the board or vice chair of the board, and people wondered why. Politically, it was wise we did not. We needed someone to make a motion and someone to second it. And had we been officers, we would not have been able to do that. At that time, we had 12 schools, 3 middle schools, 9 elementary schools, and we employed John Minor, the first African-American superintendent, Mary Hoover, a genius when it came to writing, reading. She created a reading system. What we had before was our youngsters in first grade would learn to memorize words. Look and say, look and see. Mary created a system that taught them not only phonics, but how to write, how to compose, how to articulate a whole story. Now, these teachers were kind of grumbling because part of the program we brought in is teachers had to be retrained. Our youngsters going from just sight words in one class, and if they change classes in the middle of the year, and the second teacher did not teach that system, our youngsters did not know how to read. And so Mary created a system which involved retraining our teachers. It involved taking our youngsters, teaching them one system where no matter which school they were in, no matter where they went, they could read. Now, as I had said, the teachers kind of grumbled, but they hung in there. After about 4 years, our kindergarten, first and second grade youngsters were achieving above not only the publishers who published our books, our reading books, our youngsters were achieving above the publisher's standard, as well as the state of California standard. And now the goal, and by the way, we also had computers in our system. We were one of the first school districts that had computers on an experimental basis. So our youngsters were learning that. Now, our term was up. Bob and I ran for a second term, and this time the focus, you got it, it's going to be on third, fourth grade. The goal was to make sure our youngsters were ready, were educated and ready to enter the Sequoia Union High School District. Then something happened. John Minor, at the end of his 5th year, or actually in October of his 5th year, resigned to become superintendent of the Kansas City, Missouri public school system. And now, in the meantime, our principals were growing, and at Bellhaven, we had Warren Heyman, who was one of our best principals. He was excellent, and he became the acting superintendent. Now, those of us on the board, prior to him becoming acting, we had made the decision we would do a national search. Now, and then Warren came on board as our acting superintendent while we were doing this. Things started to happen that were different than before. Bob had promised Warren that he was going to be superintendent. We had a national search going on. And out of that national search, there were 4, it was a 5-man board. 4 of us chose Dr. John Cleveland. He was African American, the chairperson of he was the director of urban education in San Diego State University, and he came highly qualified. Not only was he familiar with the Wisconsin Master Plan, the multi-unit plan, and individually guided education plan. He came with that, and our district, we had just kind of discovered the individually guided education concept. We had just started to bring it in. Well, we had Dr. Cleveland, who not only was very knowledgeable, experienced in it, he'd been training teachers in it for 4 to 5 years. Well, Bob's an excellent organizer. He won. There were 4 of us that were pro Dr. Cleveland. Bob was pro Warren Heyman. And in his organizing, it resulted in the board being marched on. It resulted in him setting up a boycott of our school for 1 day. Warren Heyman did nothing to stop that from happening. The crowd would come and be very threatening and disruptive of the school board meeting. It resulted, and the strategy was, if I could be broken away from the choice of Dr. Cleveland, then the other 3 members would cave. I stood. It resulted in harassing phone calls where the callers made it clear they were Nairobi college students. They had some made it clear they had been released from prison and they knew how to deal with people like me. I continued to stand. The crowds would come, Bob leading. I was then had to be escorted by the police to the meetings, as well as taken home in police cars from the meeting. Now, at some point, it became clear he and I had originally run for quality education. We had people involved in quality education, but, and I'm not saying Warren Heyman wasn't qualified, it was just that Dr. Cleveland was more qualified, and our children deserve that. Now, there came a shift in terms of focus now. Instead of our focus being for quality education, it shifted to, let me check my notes. It shifted to community development, which is good, except we needed our city council to get involved in that. We needed to control our police to do that, not our education system. So we had, it became very political. The community control for around economics, and the push was, and there was a new board elected, So we now had a total of 5 black board members, and the budget was $7 million, school budget though. And there was some thinking that maybe some of that money could be used as an economic base for community and economic development. Folks, I was elected. Bob and I were elected 2 consecutive 4-year terms for quality education. And we were doing it. We were going that way. We were now ready to go 3rd, 4th, through the 8th grade, putting our school on the map. But because Warren Heyman was the choice, and the politics, and the organizing to get him to become the superintendent, it ended up that I could not and did not support the priorities of the new board. So Dr. Cleveland and I resigned. And you have today an outcome of that, of what happened then. Our moderator says that I should wind down, but folks, I just did. You have today's school system as the outcome of that shift.
I moved to East Palo Alto in 1955. I had just been released from service, coming back from fighting in the Korean War. Prior to that, I grew up, I was raised in the South, and I did not even know what white people looked like in the area I was raised.
Can you all hear?
It was one of the most wonderful times of my life. And education in a segregated school district, I learned, and by the time I got to the 4th grade, my grandmother was my 4th grade teacher. She taught me, and I learned so much till when my parents moved to San Francisco to work in the war in the shipyards. That's when I really got exposed to seeing white folks. But in the school system, there in San Francisco, the 5th grade, the kids were struggling with the multiplication tables and things like that. And here in San Francisco, in an integrated school district, and I have been taught all that in the South and a segregated district. I knew my multiplication tables back and forth. So it was easy for me because the teachers I've had, the all-black teachers in all segregated schools in Louisiana, they believed in their kids and they kept us straight. And it was really, it takes a village to raise a child. All the adults were your parents. You had to answer to them. If you did something wrong, they would get on you. They would call your parents, and then your parents would back it up and get on you again. So that was very beneficial to me. That's why when I moved to East Palo Alto, I had a family, so I decided to emphasize on the education side. While all these things was going on, there was a movement in the East Palo Alto was the militant side. They didn't, a lot of veterans and things like that, that we just felt that in order to move forward, we had to do it ourselves. So when the sneak out program started, I was in a position that rather than let my children, I had 2 at the time, they had to go and live with white parents, which was wonderful that white people were able to take them in, but I just couldn't go along with it. So I sold my home in the Gardens, moved out to Mountain View, Los Altos area for 2 years for my kids to go to those schools, but they came home to their parents at night and not be with strangers that they did not know. So when they got to the junior high area, the first thing I did was buy another home. I came back and bought another home here in East Palo Alto over on Week Street for them to go to high school. Because at that time, I knew that black kids could learn and they don't need to be sitting next to white people to learn. Black people could teach other black kids. So there was a struggle. I got on the school board, and when the transfer was taking place, I opposed the busing. I was the president of the board, and I had three members, and there was other things going too. And we had a person that was very active, Walter Randall. He was a supervisor at Pacific Bell, and this is where it comes to thank God for the Negroes, because he, being in a supervisor's role, one of his jobs was to tap people's phones that the police and so forth had ordered to be tapped. And they were tapping all of our phones were being tapped. And Walt would be the one to come out and let us know who phones was tapped.
No.
So we used to have that struggle about, you're Negro. Yeah, thank God for them, because they had the jobs and they kept us informed. In fact, when they had a list of the leaders that was going to be arrested, Walt informed us of that. Martha Hanks' father, Mr. Goodwill, he started a bail bondsman system so that whenever we got arrested, his bail bonds was standing by to get us out. So when my turn came to be arrested, they arrested me for failure to identify, even though I was going in my wallet to show him my ID, take him down, and it was all set up. I called Martha's father, and I got bailed out. But just to show you how important that the education part was, that if we hadn't started the Tinsley transfer, it led to what we have today. But it was only because the board at the time refused to let the busing go forward. That it would mean that our young kids, kindergarten school, had to get up at 6 and 7 in the morning to catch a bus to go one way. And I opposed that, and the other 3 members, so that led to the Tinsley to make it both ways. Bob was right. Stokely Carmichael, we did come here and we moved forward. I have pictures now of Stokely Carmichael sitting in my living room, because when he came to East Palo Alto, he would always meet at someone's house. And I always made my home available, because during that period of time, I was single, so therefore I had a home, and I opened it to the people who was picketing downtown on University Avenue, the nonviolence. So East Palo Alto was noted for what was going on, our struggles, not just education, but independence, being able to become a city and to control our own destiny. And one of the key points that made us struggle to become a city, there have been several shootings where our youth was killed unarmed, and it was always, we were under the sheriff's jurisdiction then. It was, regardless of what happened, it was always justified homicide. The one that really triggered this city to bring the people together the most was we had a young man over on Kavanaugh, the park there, you know, not making excuses, but whatever he was doing, he started running from the police. And the police couldn't catch him, and so he jumped the fence and jumped up on a roof, and the sheriff shot him in the back and killed him. It did something to the city. I mean, it was no excuse that everybody wanted. The main thing we wanted to become an independent city is to control the police. Ever since we became a city, a lot of things didn't go quite the way we wanted to because we didn't have the tax base. But one thing that did happen, we have never had a young black man killed, unarmed black man killed since we became a city. So it is very, it is very important that we carry on the work. And I see now one of the things that we need most is to have the city council. We have to be careful who we elect to the city council, because if we don't have the skills about economic development on the council to lead, we're going to be stagnant. I'll give you one example and then I finish. At one point, we had the police chief. They were all black chiefs. But one area for a 10-year period, and I found this out when I was selected, after I retired, I was selected to serve on the grand jury. And when I served for that year on the grand jury, I volunteered to look into law enforcement. We went to hire a police chief, and the one that came out on top was a Caucasian chief that was the most qualified. The city council rejected that recommendation because they wanted a black chief, which was predominantly black then. But in doing so, choosing a chief because he was black, for almost 10 years, the city went to pot. It was just inefficiency. So while on the grand jury, we went and we did the background check, and we found out that a lot of things that it was secret and I can't even talk about now. But the basic was that we should be careful, even today, that you hire people who is qualified and have the skills and the knowledge. The chief that we had no knowledge, didn't have the skills, it was over his head, and so the crime rate was steadily growing because we didn't have the leadership in the police department to do anything about that. It turned out that when they did set standards for the East Palo Alto Police Department, the chief that we had didn't qualify because he didn't have the skills in the background. So while it's important that we control our destiny, we have to do it in a way with our own skill and informed African Americans. And I hope that we will remember that going forward. Thank you.
Should I talk for a few minutes?
Yeah, let me just make a couple of comments about the early days. In 1963, I believe it was, some of the things that Mel just talked about, the police situation was really critical. It was one of the primary factors that pushed the whole incorporation thing and kept it going. But I think it was 1964, the floating crap game, this group that was meeting, we came to the conclusion that if we were going to really be able to move forward towards incorporation, we were going to have to do more community organizing. And there were, I think, 3 white members of the floating crap game, Carl Smith and his wife, Sue Smith, Jim Dunlap, who lived on Runnymede, and Lon Otterby and his wife, Diane. But as we talked about trying to get a community organizer, we wanted to have somebody that was paid, a full-time organizer. So Carl Smith, who was a minister in the Presbyterian Church, found the money to pay a community organizer. And we started looking and did a lot of searching and tried to find people. And after a couple of months of not coming up with anyone, somebody said, Bob, would you be willing to do this? I was working as a physical therapist at the VA hospital. But I also had started several youth groups at Community House in 1963, and I see Vicki Smothers sitting over there. She was one of the kids that was in that first group. That was my first youth group, 1963. The Smothers, the Roundtrees, the Nuns. Some of you remember those families. And so they asked me, you've been doing some of this with the kids, and would you be willing to do the community organizing? So I thought about it for a couple of weeks, and I said, okay, I'll try it. But I said, if I'm going to do this, I need to be trained, and I want to be connected to an organization that can help me with this. So I chose SNCC. That's how SNCC and Stokely Carmichael got involved in this community. I went to Atlanta for the SNCC staff meeting in that first year. I met Stokely and Rap Brown and all of the people that were in SNCC and that were doing great things at that time. And Stokely and Rap Brown began to come to this community and meet with the floating crap game. And we began to adopt their philosophy of community control of our own destiny. And I remember one night we were at Jim Dunlap's house, and we were strategizing about how we were going to integrate the high schools. Stokely was there. He sat there. This meeting must have gone on around 2.5 hours. Stokely never said a word. At the end of the meeting, somebody asked him, what do you think about our strategy and what we want to do to integrate the schools? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. We said, well, wait a minute, but that's what's happening at the national level. The whole thing is about integrating schools. He said, that's not our posture. He said, let me ask you a question. Why would you be so eager and anxious to send the minds of your children to the white people who oppress you for 400 years and think that they're going to do anything about really giving your children a quality education? We started looking around at each other. Wait a minute. Now, the day school at that time was only on Saturday. It was a part-time school. The next day, Gertrude and I and a couple other people met. We said, you know what? We got to do something. So we decided we were going to make the day school a full-time school, and then we were going to look at how do we begin to get control of the other institutions within East Palo Alto. And as Syrtilla said, the first one that came up was the elementary school board, because that was something that we could control. We had enough votes on this side of the freeway that we could elect people. And the little youth group that was in operation, that was a group called YUC, Youth Unlimited Corporation. And those kids got out on the streets, pounded on doors, passed out all the literature, and got us elected. So that's kind of how this community control of our own destiny kind of started. And I wanted to make one last comment about the Teen Summer Project, because that's one of the things that I'm really extremely proud of.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whose idea it was, but it was somewhere between me and Gertrude. There was an Upward Bound program at Stanford, and kids were coming back from the Upward Bound program talking bad about East Palo Alto, and, you know, we don't know what we're doing here, and all of this stuff. We said, wait a minute, what the hell's going on? So we closed down the Upward Bound program at Stanford and started the Teen Summer Project. We went to Washington, talked to the people who were in the Department of Education that was funding Upward Bound. They agreed to stop funding Stanford and help to fund the program. A lot of the money came from the county to run that first Teen Summer Project. And so that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, because I still meet a lot of people who were in it, and they tell me it was one of the best things that ever happened to them. So I'm going to tell you one last story about Stokely. I hope some of you, how many of you were at the last speech that Stokely gave in East Palo Alto in 1972 at Ravenwood High School? Anybody here remember that?
I was there.
Stokely, Martin Luther King had been killed and Malcolm had been killed. Stokely came here, he gave one of his last major addresses that he ever gave in this country, here in East Palo Alto at Ravenwood High School. And he talked about the demise of the National Civil Rights Movement. The strategy among people were to kill the leadership, in other words, cut off the head of the snake and kill the movement. And he knew he was next on the list. So he gave that speech. And at the end of the speech, somebody asked him, you know, they've killed Martin and Malcolm, and, you know, you're leaving the country. What's going to happen to us now? And I swear this is his words verbatim. He said, I think they're going to flood our community with drugs, and we're going to eat ourselves up from the inside. By 1975, in 3 years after that, this community and every black community in this country was swimming in drugs. That was one of the most prophetic statements I have ever heard come out of anybody's mouth, and we are still trying to recover from that to this day.
Okay, thank you, Bob. I'm going to conclude. I mainly wanted to give that opening address because, as a historian, that's been my primary.
We have one more project, and it has to do. We have one more project, and it has to do with health. Yes, we were concerned about education, but our people also were concerned about health. We had Bobby Kennedy was alive and very pro community health, and had set up funds, department for community health, and it was structured locally, a community action council. And this is where local people could bring their ideas regarding health to the council, and if the ideas were merited, were worth it, it could end up going to Washington and being funded. Well, here in East Palo Alto, we weren't going to let that just stay. We were going to become a part of that. And a group was organized. Many of us came from the floating crab game. It's just that we spun off and this time focused on health. A proposal was written, and we had to have community support. What was most exciting, one night when it was time for the council to vote on the presenting proposal, Jackie Hoover, Bob's younger brother, stood and said, okay, y'all, I'll stand. And the entire auditorium stood. And obviously, the Community Action Council accepted our proposal. It went off to Washington. It was on the verge of being funded, and we got the word we needed a training program. I was on the board, had been part of the writing of the proposal, and now it wasn't going to get funded because we did not have a training program. I resigned from the board, wrote the training program, and today, what was once the East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park Neighborhood Health Center became the Drew Medical Center, medical clinic. And that's still going.
Thank you, Syrtilla. Can you hear me?
And one of our first hirees for the clinic.
I was a young man and I was headed for the major leagues, had an injury, went to college, told my wife, I'm going to finish this science and engineering, but I'm going to be a musician, right? And one of my students had become famous, Pharaoh Saunders. And so I told her, when I finish this degree, I'm going to be a musician. So if you don't want to be a musician's wife, leave now. And she said, oh, great, because her auntie was Betty Carter. I don't know if you know her, but she's a famous jazz singer. So, but I got involved in this through Israel Harris. The Harris family became like the kid's second father. And that's from 1964 to 1970. So I mentioned the Black Panther Party of Northern California while I was on that. And Israel Harris was unofficially part of us. But I was part of the Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, which I spoke of earlier, and then later the Black Panther Party. And we decided, we can't just be theorists or activists. We got to root ourselves. So I was invited to come here by Israel and others. I said, what am I going to do? He said, we want you to write up a training program for all the paraprofessionals. So that's how I came to East Palo Alto. But in terms of Nairobi College, I had told my wife, I think we'd like to start a school. And I came here and said that. And somebody said, oh, some people are already doing that. I said, who? Oh, some guy named Bob Hoover and his wife Mary and some other people. So I came to Bob and said, Bob, I'd like to teach a music class to have words that are political, right? That are educational for us, but black music. He says, well, there's a lady that's already started a class. Why don't you go work with her? And that became what came to be known as Nairobi Messengers. All right? So that's how I came to this community and ended up doing that. I was involved in the Warren Heyman campaign. She didn't go into that. Thank you, Syrtilla. But anyway, that's how I got here. People talk about what happened after that. And so the health center was my primary concern. It lasted, I was there about 5-6 years. I later became the personnel officer. And you know what happened, as I told in the movement, the thing that dismayed me most was that people left. When the property values went up, rather than stay here and let it build, they sold their houses. Rose Gibson, who will speak, said, well, Vulindlela, we can't complain. We left. And a lot of people sold their houses and got houses the other way. And a few of them I've talked to, they said, I wish I could get back there, but I said, you can't do that now. It costs you $1 million. So anyway, I'd like to thank the committee members. Very educational.
We haven't said a word about how Nairobi College started.
Oh. Oh, that's right. And that was 1968 when I came here, and it had started already.
Could you also say why Nairobi? How did the name come about?
Good. Thank you, Wally.
Okay, well, let me talk about the Nairobi College, and then we're going to have Omo to talk about that other part. When we, in 1967, it was the first year of the Teen Summer Project, and I turned out to be the first leader of the Teen Summer Project and kind of ran it that first year. Near the end of the summer, someone from the College of San Mateo, and I can't remember who it was now, came to ask me if I would be interested in coming to work at the College of San Mateo in the college readiness program. Jean Worth, there was this tall, 6'6" white woman had started the program at CSM, and she was running it then. but they somehow figured they needed to have some black input in helping with the program. When I got there, I think there were maybe 60 black students on the campus, and out of something like a 12,000 student body or something like that. And our goal was to raise the level of student enrollment, black student enrollment, and so over the next 2 years, we recruited about 500 students. The white board of directors for the college got nervous about having all these people of color on that campus, and so they stopped applying for the federal financial aid money. And when that happened, we didn't, of course, didn't have the funds to help students support themselves and get through college. And in 1969, there was a student takeover of the administration building, a sit-in, a whole lot of stuff went down. Some of our people got John Brandon, and I'm trying to think of the other young brother that got arrested. John Brandon wound up spending a number of years in prison behind that stuff. And they fired me and Gene Worth, and all the students left the campus. That same day, we came to a meeting at Gertrude Wilkes' house on Saratoga, and students were sitting around talking about, okay, well, what do we, I'm saying, you guys got to go back to school. They said, we're not going back to San Mateo without you and Gene. So somebody, I don't even know who it was, said, we need to start our own college.
That's it. Right.
And more students started saying, yeah. I said, are y'all crazy? We got no money. We don't have anybody that knows anything about running a college, and you talking about starting a college. They insisted. Sally, I think it was Sally Smith. So the conversation kind of went on, and we said, well, you know, how are we going to get some money to start? Sally, there was a girl who was a tutor, a white girl from Hillsborough. Her last name was Weaver. I don't remember her first name, but her mother's name was Jean Weaver. So somebody said, why don't we go talk to Miss Weaver? Jean Weaver was a member of the Colgate family, which the Colgate toothpaste and the Cincinnati Bengals and all. So this woman had money. We went to a meeting with her and talked, and her daughter is the one that convinced her to do it. So she said, okay, I'll give $100,000 the first year. I was also in a thing with David Packard. Ed Bex and I were co-chairs of an organization called Common Ground. David Packard was the other co-chair. So he agreed to put up some money. The president of Stanford was part of that group. And so that's how it got started. I got nailed as the president, which means I had to go raise the rest of the money that we needed. I had not ever raised a nickel from nobody. I didn't know a damn thing about raising money, but I learned quickly. I went to New York on my first trip, and I met Hugh Burroughs. I see Hugh Burroughs is registered for this, so I'm hoping that he comes. Hugh Burroughs is working for the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was a guy who put up the first foundation money to keep the college rolling. Now, Gene Worth and I had done some work for the Department of Education, reading proposals and grants and stuff, so we had a kind of an in with the Department of Education. We went and talked with them about how do we continue with federal financial aid, and they said, well, you got to start the accreditation process. And one of the key parts that we needed was to have access to a library and some other things. So we met with Lyman, who was the president of Stanford. He agreed to let us use Stanford University's library as our library, and also our students could go to Stanford and take classes. And so that's how Nairobi started. And the students were the people who started Nairobi College. And then we had people like Omo and Hank Oregon and Gertrude and, you know, the whole floating crap game that kind of stood behind it, supported it, and then just did all the things that propelled it into being what it became. So I wanted to make sure that we said something about the starting of the college because it was a dominant force in this community for a number of years.
No, I actually,
Would
it
you
was
like to
already
explain?
called Nairobi when I came. I came to Stanford in '67. So somebody up there has to answer that.
It started out of the Teen Summer Project. We decided that there was never, East Palo Alto never had a name. It was the city east of Palo Alto. They dropped the of. So that came East Palo Alto. So it was raised in the Teen Summer Project. And we had the college students and the rest of the high school students. So they came up with the idea, we came up with the idea, let's change the name. We came up with 3 names. One was Dar es Salaam, one was Nairobi, and one of them was another East African name I forget. We actually held, we did a survey, and the overwhelming choice was Nairobi College. Nairobi College is another thing. And so, but what happens is with a lot of time with student movements, the students went back to school, and when it got to the ballot, we weren't able there to push it, and it failed. But you can still mail a letter to Nairobi today, and it will still get here to East Palo Alto. So that's how the name Nairobi became, how it became Nairobi.
We become a sister city of Nairobi, actually. Yeah, we actually were considered ourselves a sister city. Nairobi was our sister city. And, if that election had been just us, it would have made it. But it was a county-wide election. So the whole county voted on whether we could change our name, and so we're going to lose that one. Yeah, and we were not, thank you, Omo, we were not incorporated. So we were an unincorporated area for the whole county, which means everything up here, all the way up to San Francisco County, had to vote on whether we should change our name. We lost that one because of...
The Teen Summer Project was so important, and it was played a vital part. And then we need to acknowledge some of those people who were first. Karen Owen. What's your name, Karen? Karen. I was one of the original
story about Karen.
students who advocated for us starting our own college. So we've got some of those people who are still here today. And we have some other students who were instrumental. Vicky. Oh, Vicky Smothers. Yeah, we have Vicky Smothers.
Oh, God, no.
Then we have 2 of our stars over here. The Mitchells. And their parents were very supportive of the college and what we were doing. Matter of fact, we have 2 doctors, and they were part of Nairobi College. Sherry and Nanette were part of that whole movement. And there are others. We've got one of the Randalls here. I've got pictures of them in the Nairobi schools. And, they were all part of it. So it started with. And the other thing that we need to point out, the school system said that it took 6 months to teach these kids their ABCs, phonics, colors, concept, and the whole idea. We were doing it in the backyards of people for 6 weeks. And when the summer project was over, those kids were on it. But the other idea is that, we started talking and we said, we're doing all this work, we're getting them up here, and then we have to surrender them back to the enemy. Yeah. And so that was the idea behind the EPA, what did we have? The weekend we had we had Saturday school.
Yes, right.
And then it evolved, like Bob said, into a full-time thing. We have to do this if we want to ensure our survival and to keep ourselves relevant. We had to do that. We had to start our own school system. So that's what we did. Omawale, I think Omawale is going to talk about that because.
Yeah, they'll do that.
Could
I have just a moment? We've got this by decades because you can see if you had done that, people would be talking about what happened in the 60s and the 90s and the 70s, and you get confused.
Yeah.
I certainly could have talked, but I limited it to this. So finish, Don, what were you going to say?
I'm good. Omo is going to bring us. Omo, you know, when I became president of the college, I relied heavily on Omo and Hank Oregon and the different people. They were our fundraisers. Omo out-traveled a college board president. They looked down and said, who is this guy? He's all over the country. But Omo was out doing the people's work. And so was Hank, who was in the fundraising office at Stanford, was one of our key fundraisers.
That'll be your 80s panel you're going to.
That's coming down.
Yeah, it's coming this
So
afternoon.
there's a lot. You cannot tell the story of East Palo Alto and what happened in 2 days.
No.
And you're certainly not going to be able to cover it in a couple of panels.
Cool.
So hopefully this will stimulate, and what we're hoping that will come out of this with Jesse and the different people is something that we can document. I go all over the country, and I'm sure Omo does too, and we see people reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
Things that we have done. We created CB, the Council of Independent Black Institutions. We have a history. We have a history that you should all be proud of. Project Bigot, where we had a 36-foot trailer home, mobile home, where we would pull up on high school campuses and work with students for 2 to 3 years until they were ready to go to college. And we had relationships with colleges all over the country. And we'll get into that, and maybe we had exchange programs with, we had Africa. We brought one of the first female students out of Africa, out of West Africa at least, to Nairobi, because at that time they weren't letting women out of the country. So there are a lot of firsts that we did, and we'll be talking about it later on.
Yeah, the 70s and 80s is really the critical, 1970 is the critical period for here, and they will be covering that.